It is far too late for us to stop climate change from happening. Political will does not exist. The mechanisms are far too distant. It is intangible in the minds of people around the world. We need to change the framework by which we think of climate change. It is not something that is happening in 50 years. It is happening now, and it is devastating the most vulnerable areas of the world, particularly developing countries. On opening government, we're going to set up two criteria for us to take this round. The first is, we just have to prove that we will provide the most immediate relief to the most vulnerable people in the world. And the second is, we create the greatest likelihood for change to happen in the first place. That is what we're going to stand on, defend, and win on. But in terms of what the comparative in the round is, we think sides have to pick one or the other. Right? You have limited resources, political will, and capital. You have to pick either prevention or adaptation as the narrative for which you pursue this, and the policies that you carry out in return. What do we think that looks like? We say that prevention looks like things like setting targets at the Paris Climate Agreement, things like stopping oil industries from continuing to proliferate their industries moving forward. Whereas adaptation is more things like creating flood barriers, creating things like algae plantations in oceans, things like carbon being dug into the ground and those sorts of things. I think the comparative is pretty clear. First argument, why is this the measure that's going to provide the most immediate relief? Let's paint a picture of the urgency of this. The Maldives are going to be underwater in 50 years, and even if we reach things like the Paris agreements, by 2050, in our own lifetimes, we're going to reach 3.3 degrees Celsius rises in temperature. That's Celsius for the American people in the crowd. I think what that means is, a lot of people can't conceptualize what that means. It's extremely intangible in their minds. But in terms of the urgency that we feel today, especially in the developing world, it looks like your community being underwater very soon. It looks like your crops drying out and you no longer being able to sustain yourself moving forward. So what do we envision adaptation to look like, and why does it provide the most immediate relief? We think things like climate targets are completely unrealistic and intangible of the minds of people in the developed world who pollute disproportionately the most over everybody else. And even if you have small changes on a global scale, I think these changes happen much faster because people say, this is what's happening to that person in that developing country. They're no longer able to sustain themselves. At this point, if we change these things for them, they're able to. It is, crucially, an on-the-ground approach to how you view the effects of climate change. Because the top-down approach that exists with prevention is one in which you have to have corporations, you have to have governments at the highest level being able to decide these policies. For reasons in my second argument, I'll describe to you why that's unlikely to happen. But crucially, it means that people are more likely to say, this is something happening now that we have to deal with right away. We're going to send that relief. We're going to send those algae plantations. We're going to clean up the oceans for these people immediately. But the most important part of this argument in any capacity is that it looks to the developing world in a timeline of urgency that is now versus 50 years, that shifts resources immediately to them in a way that that top-down approach simply cannot, because it looks to strong and powerful actors having to stop their profitable behaviors in ways that the incentives that currently exist on the international stage just wouldn't warrant, because we still operate on like neoliberalism and capitalism and exploitations of these vulnerable areas of the world. Second argument, the likelihood for change. I want to clarify, this is where the debate really happens and teams have to contest us on likelihood of change from the top-down approach. That's their burden. First reason why the top-down approach doesn't work. It's extremely short-termist because politicians are going to prioritize in a 5-year electoral term the growth of their economy over something that they don't really understand is going to happen to them in 50 years, especially in areas of the world like the developed north that are extremely wealthy in regards to that and don't understand the plights of poor people around the world. It also has a narrative of creating versus taking away jobs. When you say you want to prevent stuff by shutting down oil companies, by shutting down coal, it's extremely visceral to these people in the developed world because they say, this is my livelihood, this is my job, and that paints it in such a way that is unfavorable to them. We say you have to allow some time to take away and chip away at this, but in the meantime, do subsidies for things like green energy, subsidies for renewable energies moving forward because you're adapting to this. But that narrative does not happen when you say we have to take things from you right away, and therefore people are scared of this situation and put off anything that's going to result in actual tangible change, especially in the developing world. So, we generate this urgency because the belief, and this is so important, like the belief that you can prevent something allows you to, in your mind, put it off. right? It doesn't have to happen now. I don't have to solve it now. Next generation, the next politician can take care of this. I don't have to do this now. That's extremely dangerous for these people, especially because they believe that it's something that can be solved later on. It creates very simply a collective action problem, where nobody wants to take the first step because nobody understands how to prevent climate change, and even when that's labeled out to you by scientists, by professionals in the industry, by environmental activists, you don't listen to them because corporations have an incentive for you not to listen to them, for you to disregard the analysis that is being provided by these scientists. But on corporations specifically, they have huge lobbying power in the developed world especially, even in the developing world. Like there's a lot of oil industries that happen that are extremely devastating to these communities. They have legal power, they have lobbying, they have jobs, they are able to control media narratives in such a way that you no longer think that things can change. What is the OG counterfactual your back half?
So irrespective of which one is more likely, can you just walk me through how an algae farm is going to save everyone from dying? Like I just don't.
Look, that's hilarious. We never said we're going to save everybody from dying. They have to say they're saving everybody from dying, and they have to prove that prevention will actually happen for that to be meaningful. We're saying we're going to help people to be prevented from dying now. If your oceans are clean because you're sucking out the carbon from them, that means you can fish more, and sustain yourselves for these coastal communities. It's an immediate impact. Having flood barriers prevents your community from being washed out. That's what we mean. It's so tangible. It clearly helps people. What is the OG counterfactual? We think that it's far more politically viable because there is a tangibility to it. That tangibility of saying that person's home is going to be wrecked now as opposed to in 50 years means it's more likely for you to be receptive to these ideas, especially when they're not backed against the notion that your job's going to be taken away because the dirty green environmentalists are trying to suck out your jobs from these industries. It's more on the ground, it's politically viable because states are willing to take on this action if they feel like they're helping people as opposed to preventing their own profit motivations. This is extremely important for this round, and what has to be weighed in this debate is that this is something that's happening now that can be adapted to, and that prevention is extremely intangible because it sets unrealistic goals that make you defer this urgency moving forward, and thus creating you in a position where you can no longer return.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for those remarks, and now call on the Leader of the Opposition.
I have a boring OO that will beat the OG case in 2 minutes to just wait why the concepts of what are actually going to be successful are not accounting for the vast majority of scenarios. But I think there's something a lot more important in this round than just the mechanism itself. I want you to know how profoundly anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and colonial this motion is. The violence that particularly affects these people always forces resettlement of Indigenous communities. It always forces extraction from Africa and from Latin America. These are the requirements that happen when you don't want to divest away from oil, but instead you want to build flood barriers around the over 1,000 islands of Indonesia. You guys have not considered the fact that the profound effect of your policy only benefits continental states. It only benefits white states. It only benefits those that have the resources to prevent. People do not have the resources to prevent. We do have an obligation to save them. We have an obligation to not just prevent, but to reverse climate change. And we're going to win that with the rest of the 5 minutes of the OO. So, basic success weighing. I want you to know to start with, some things cannot be adapted to. This includes things like water potability. This is incredibly difficult to adapt to and incredibly inaccessible for a lot of places. But even flood barriers, brother, how high are these flood barriers going to be for long? Also, are you going to build 1,000 flood barriers surrounding all 1,000 plus islands of Indonesia? A lot of your solutions are completely ineffective for a lot of the places we talk about in the world that are coincidentally the most affected by climate change. And absent a clear answer for how we can always adapt in most scenarios, I think you're unlikely to resolve that. But here's a fun fact about climate change. Since climate change hurts certain places the most, stopping climate change probably helps them the most. I think adapting them helps them the least. But more a basic weighing. I want you to also note that it's incredibly hard to predict just how climate change can affect people. I want you to know how we only recently discovered that there were frozen but live bacteria frozen in Siberia that threatened to wipe out entire ecosystems on account of that. That is not something that we have the time by the time we finally realize this and detect this to meaningfully accommodate for. There is a time pressure that we cannot predict into the future that is something opening government and closing government, no government, can ever account for. More than that though, also understand that for our policy to work, you actually only need one state to really go in on this. But on their world, they actually need a wide collection of wealthy states always wanting to invest in these developing world countries to make sure that they can actually access, as the global south, adaptive measures. The problem with this is that this is always conditional aid, and that itself is colonial, but I'm going to get to that in the end of my speech. But just note the collective action required for the government bench. Lastly, on this basic weighing, I just want to say that prevention also includes reversal. It includes things like carbon capture that are emerging. It's not just like, oh, we're going to get rid of oil and like hope that things work out. Like, thanks, NDP. No, sorry, there's a bit more extreme measures that we're going to do, and they're actually going to be effective. On to the fun stuff. Let's talk about, well, actually really not fun stuff. Colonialism and anti-indigeneity. I want you to note here that the West is locking the developing world into an endless cycle of resettlement. The reason for this is simple, because climate change destroys land. It makes it unable to extract for agriculture, unable to live because of temperature and drought. It is impossible to live there. This obviously affects indigenous communities that have tens of thousands of years of history and spiritual connection to this land, ways of life around this land, and they're the ones that are forced to resettle. This is not just an accident. This is often on purpose. Note that when Bolsonaro started torching the rainforest, torching the Amazon, the communities he targeted first were actually language isolate communities, essential in protesting the state. These were the people that did not have the language, knowledge to challenge through the international community ways to prevent it. These were the people that were targeted first. These were the people that were targeted with genocide in 2019 to make sure that we could burn down the Amazon. And we're thinking that the answer is to just adapt to not punishing Brazil for this instead of structurally preventing things like the agricultural industry from being important. Please fucking tell me how that's going to be justice for indigenous communities in Latin America. It will never be justice for those indigenous communities. Latin America is the most dangerous region in the world for environmental activists, and it's because the state threatens them with violence. But the US does not consider asylum a category that can apply to environmental violence refugees. That's why Honduras is a large source of illegal immigration into the United States. It's because they're not recognized for their struggles, but it is unsafe for them to focus the incredibly localized areas. It is incredibly specific towns and locations in Honduras that are subject to violence. That's really important because their case only works for possible resettlement. The only people who can access that resettlement are entire nations that are destroyed. That fucking sucks for the people that have localized violence at the corporate extractive level. How do we fix this extraction? I think first wholesale, moving away from extraction not only is going to resolve a lot of the issues about how climate change itself contributes, just emissions, global warming, destructuring arable soil that holds on to carbon. These are clean impacts. But I also want you to note here that the issue that also happens with extraction is that it locks the developing world into a relationship with the West where they cannot restructure their economy into dependence and ability to be free. That's really important because if these communities are at risk and they want to be able to develop things like, flood barriers that win OG apparently, maybe they have more freedom to do so when they don't have to endlessly funnel labor, resources, and land into the extraction for the United States of America. That's fucking bullshit, and that is not going to be something that will allow them to possibly resettle, possibly restructure, and escape the colonial impacts of climate change. OG.
So, environmental migration is an inevitability. When the developed world thinks that it can prevent this change, it doesn't realize that it has to adapt to the idea that people might have to flee from their countries because of this happening.
No, environmental migration is not an inevitability because it is very, very, very specifically linked to climate change and environmental destruction. That happens at a corporate level to destroying rivers in Honduras, for example. It also happens at a large-scale level, increasing temperatures to the point that you are no longer having arable land. By the way, that's literally the thing that caused the initial conflict that later evolved into the Arab Spring and widespread violence in the Middle East. It was climate change that caused a humanitarian crisis that has then now even engulfed Yemen into endless political conflicts. I don't know how you adapt Yemen to make them not face climate change when political violence is the only way of life they're ever able to access. That's unacceptable and inexcusable just so the West can say, oh, we're gonna be fucking fine, or because coastal fucking West Africa is going to be fine. That's not a good enough answer, government. So, structuring adaptation. What is the concrete change that we provide? Firstly, when you have the resources that are free from endlessly fending towards the extraction of the West, the first and foremost thing you're able to do is fend for yourself. And fending for yourself gives you the freedom to adapt in the ways that opening government wants. If this is even something that is going to be effective, the best way for you to do this is by giving the resources to countries to monopolize how that happens at their own level, rather than at the expense of the West. I want you to note that when Burma was hit by like a typhoon, they rejected all Western aid because of the colonial implications of how that aid had to be structured and used. That means that there's an incentive in their world to not even accept the adaptations that are offered, especially considering that these adaptations are almost always reactive in the worst cases. People generally never have access to. Opening government is so short-sighted, they're so Western-centric, and they're so continental-centric, they do not answer for Indigenous violence, and they do not answer for the long-term thing that will actually save the fucking earth.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for those remarks, and now call upon the Prime Minister.
Opening opposition lacked a mechanism, and outside of the usual parameters of that just being a reason to not vote for them in the debate, that lack of a mechanism meant that there was a time period in which they chased a hopeless dream that was unlikely to happen even in the most stringent requirements, even in the regulations that currently exist, even if every country followed the Paris Climate Agreement, which is also not likely because the US has just pulled out. Given that is the case then, in that time period, the victims will not be thus in the West. The victims will be the very individuals within these developing nations that will have to flee. The victims will be the indigenous individuals that have to deal with massive flooding, have to deal with the massive harms of climate change right away. Where does the prevention come from? That is the question that nobody on opposition bench has explained to you, and that is the question that Gautier, from the top of his Prime Minister's speech, explained was unlikely to happen in the very first place. I have two clarifications in the beginning of this round. First of all, I want to note that the way in which you weigh this round is pretty certain. Until opposition has proven to us any type of empiric evidence that they are able to change the likelihood that prevention is able to happen, despite all the things that we tell you right now about the status quo, you always have to weigh that up against each other. Given that's the case then, I think at most maybe they change prevention from 0% to 5%. Maybe even if I was really charitable to 10%. But even in that instance, there is a large, massive group of individuals that are not safe right now. The second clarification, at most, opposition can fight for the status quo. And there is little to nothing that they have prevented and explained to us as to why it is that the status quo is changing for the better. Because we told you what we could do is take the wasted funds that we've done or we had already. We can take it and we can use it towards bringing massive relief for these people right now. So that's why I want to talk about three things. First, on colonialism and anti-indigeneity. Secondly, on does prevention work, the crucial tenet of our case. And third of all, does relief work, which we didn't talk about at all. I think it was very easy for them to be flippant and call it flood barriers, but it looked like the ability to invest in things such as GMOs that were able to ensure that you were dealing with something such as the worst droughts in the world. Maybe flood barriers are flippant to you, but it means individuals that are no longer losing their homes. So, starting off with colonialism and anti-indigeneity, there are two things to note about this. First of all, in their best case scenario, let's assume that prevention happens. I'll be even more charitable. Let's assume that it happens in 50 years. In those 50 years, the ones that are victims first are likely to be the exact groups of individuals that we talk about. But secondly, and this is crucial in the comparative, right now, the way in which we look at prevention has to be from a top-down approach. And that's not just top-down in terms of just like companies vs people. It's top-down in terms of the global north vs the global south. Because prevention is focused on allocating funds to ensure that the global north stops polluting the shit out of us anymore. Jesus. While the grounds-up approach of climate change prevention looks at dealing with the consequences first. The consequences all fall on the same victims that opening opposition talks about. And in that time, they don't want to wait for oil companies to be able to stop polluting so much. They want some relief now. The second thing that they tell you is that, oh wow, but you have extractive economies, and those extractive economies are equally bad. But literally, like CG in the World Finals this year won on a corporate control point. Corporate control exists. It is one that currently has a stronghold on our democracy, and it is one that ensures that there will be no way that they shift the economies right away. Does prevention work? Even if CEO comes with better analysis, I want you to right away weigh it up with the 4 mechanisms that Gautier identifies for you. What were they? Starting off with politics. First of all, it was the fact that it was oftentimes politicians were incredibly short-termist. Secondly, it was the fact that you change the narrative now, because it's about the creation of jobs when you have more individuals working on building infrastructure to prevent climate change compared to the taking away of jobs when you prevent coal miners who they can have one story about who are able, Eva Marie, I know you just saw me use this analysis, but coal miners that you can use one story about to stop the rest of climate change prevention movement from doing anything again. Third of all, though, it was the fact that corporations had far more legal power. Right now, if we were able to cut down on our carbon emissions, the estimate is that oil companies and coal companies lose $2 trillion. They won't lose that without a fighting battle. So you always have an attack against you. There was always a threat against this movement as well. I want to know 2 things more about this. Number 1, climate change prevention is oftentimes retroactive. It looks like forcing an oil company to pay settlements after they polluted, which means that oftentimes it's the case that that settlement isn't even powerful because the environmental movement never has the legal power to compare to them as well. Secondly, that even in their best case scenario on prevention oftentimes disproportionately hurts the most poor as well. Because it is not the CEOs of oil companies that are losing out, it is the labor that is currently working away in these developing nations that lose their jobs right away as well. So even on their best case scenario, the victims first of prevention are likely going to be those most vulnerable. What I want to note for you though, is that these solutions are effective. It was flippant for them to deal with it otherwise. The only other response they had is that it is oftentimes just one state. Once you have one state on board, then you are able to have climate change prevention. This is fucking ridiculous. Oftentimes it is the case that the real problem with it is that you can have one state investing heavily in climate change adaptation that doesn't need all the other states, but when you're only focused on preventing carbon emissions, maybe China focuses on preventing carbon emissions, but the US doesn't. And suddenly the problem simultaneously stays the same. So in terms of prevention, there is no ability for us to prevent it right now. Gautier paints to you the context of the problem, what this problem looks like, which is that we are losing that and fighting the consequences of it right now. How do we fight these consequences? That was the main thrust of our case. Our consequences told you that number 1, you change the narrative of climate change to being something intangible to tangible. You change the political narrative to something that politicians actually want to hop on, that investors see as a stable investment. It's about the creation of jobs rather than taking away of jobs as well. But most importantly, if nothing else, even if you don't buy any of these mechanisms, you take away the wasted billions of dollars that you're currently having in having fancy like climate agreements in Paris and put it towards being able to have a fucking flood barrier to ensure that the floods are no longer destroying the most populated cities with the individuals that are the most vulnerable, with the individuals that have no political voice to say otherwise. In a world in which these consequences are already happening, opposition does nothing about it. Open government provides you solution. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for those remarks, and now call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Big ideas. First of all, what does adaptation actually look like? Second of all, where are the places people hit and how are they actually impacted on the other side? And thirdly, on language. Firstly then on adaptation. Opening Government's fatal flaw in this round was in asserting to you that adaptation will be effective. they tell you that the comparative that they set up in this round is either everyone's going to die on opening opposition or everyone is saved on government. That is not correct winning. NOAA gives you a number of reasons as to why adaptation is likely to be ineffective. The first is that we literally do not know how to deal with things like rising oceans, right? Even Venice, a very developed city, literally does not know what it's going to do in the next 10 years with that flood. I have no idea how we're going to do that in Indonesia. Chris's response to that is just, no, we're not only talking about flood barriers, we're also talking about things like GMOs. With that kind of thing, it's even less clear how we're going to adapt to that, right? With the massive amount of desertification you're seeing in places like Africa, it is almost inevitable that those droughts cause humongous food shortages in their local communities. We have literally no idea how we're going to solve these problems. The assertion to you that we get to stop the effects of climate change now is laughable, because what it's actually going to mean is we are going to have to invest like 10 to 20 years of research into understanding how to stop these floods when they are in fact happening now. What we can do is focus on preventing this in terms of the things that we do know. But that's the third reason why adaptation is a bad strategy and likely to be ineffective. And that's because we actually don't know the long-term effects of climate change. We know broadly what is happening right now in terms of desertification and flooding, but we have no idea what's going to happen in 50 years, you guys. If we give up on stopping climate change, it is almost inevitable that something unpredictable will happen to our climate, since it is almost impossible for us to meaningfully understand exactly what is happening on this earth, so that we will not be able to adapt to everything. Adaptation relies on us being able to predict exactly the problems that will face us. We have no scientific evidence as to what those things are likely to be. So do not buy the comparative on Refugee. They do not get to save everyone, and we don't have everyone die. Note that they have to also invest years upon years of research into actually getting these adaptive mechanisms, which we have no evidence will actually be effective. But next, what does prevention meaningfully look like? Because I think opening government squanders this as well, right? We aren't talking about the fucking Paris meeting, guys. We're talking about climate recapture. We're talking about ozone regeneration. These things are meaningful scientific advancements that have evidence behind them and can meaningfully mitigate the changes that we are seeing in climate change. For them to say we need to weigh this against emission reduction was so laughable and such a bad characterization of opposition that opening government should fall out of this round. It also means that we get to slow down the progress of climate change. Because note that something like saving the Amazon or replanting the Amazon are preventative measures, because the Amazon rainforest is a carbon sink that is meaningfully important to slowing down the progress of climate change. That makes adaptation more effective because we have more time to deal with it, you guys. Right now, flooding is happening way too fast for us ever to meaningfully save all those lives. What we can do by having prevention, even if we don't literally get rid of climate change, means that we can slow it down enough that adaptation can happen more organically. There's literally no way that we can adapt to climate change that exists right now, especially if it's exacerbated by completely foregoing all preventative measures. Secondly, there are the places that are hardest hit. Everyone agrees that that's likely to be the developing world. What does that mean, though? By focusing on adaptation, that means that we are far more focused on massive resettlement. That not only exists because we need to resettle people because of the actual climate change that's happening, but when we actually stop the ability for us to prevent various resource extractions, that means that local indigenous communities currently being displaced by those extractive practices. That looks like indigenous communities in places even like Canada, where we are currently displacing them for pipeline development. That means that those people continue to be displaced. That is harming the most vulnerable and harming their ability to connect with the resources that they are literally entitled to. But secondly, on those people most hard hit, right? Note that we can still not actually account for the long-term changes of climate change. Even if we are to put flood barriers up on the 1,000 islands in Indonesia, we have literally no idea how we are going to deal with the massive droughts in Africa, or the multitude of hurricanes that are going to happen across Asia, right? We don't know how to resettle those people. We don't know how to deal with them. Opening government asserting to you that we get to save lives on their side and we don't on theirs was a lie. Do not believe that binary. But thirdly then, or more on resource extraction first, sorry. When you exacerbate climate change, that means it happens faster, right? When you stop these preventative measures, that means far less political will and literal capital exists towards moving towards procedures that don't work, right? That means you get far less green energy investment. That means you get far less investment in any kind of prevention of that kind of thing. When you we can make climate change significantly worse if we stop these preventative measures. That means that climate change happens even faster on their side. It harms even more people in ways that we literally cannot adapt to as fast. Something that OG literally just asserts. Closer.
Sure. Right now, the African Union does not want climate target settlements because it sees those as racist and the West imposing targets that it never had to abide by in the first place. Why do you change that on your side?
Yeah, so that's on my likelihood theme. I'll get to that right now just so it's clear. So, on political will, NOAA tells you that we actually don't need as much compliance on our side of the house. That is because, again, we aren't talking about reductions in emissions. We are talking about actual things that can mitigate the effects of climate change through research. That looks like massive investments in research in things like carbon recapture and things like ozone regeneration. Those things do not require international compliance because you are able to mitigate the effects of climate change as a single actor. You are able to intervene in things globally as the West Note that that is, one, more practically likely, given that you need less international compliance, which is always less likely to happen, but notably they're also less likely to comply with adaptive measures for things like drought, because they also need to see those things as being colonial. But two, it's principally better because the West is able to actually take responsibility for the fucked up things it has done since the 1800s, right? We are able to actually solve the effects of the things that we are doing as opposed to putting the onus on developing countries where they are having to suffer from the things that we extracted from them. No thanks. But let's also talk about the likelihood of what OG gives you, right? Because they tell you that they're more likely to get this because adaptation is a more pressing and tangible issue. While that may be true, note their reliance on democratic support, right? One, it is far less likely that you get investment where you need the money, right? Because poor countries that currently are suffering from the effects of climate change are not the ones that we need democratic support for. It's places that are currently fucking up those countries that have the capital to invest in adaptive measures, right? At that point, you don't have a reason for Canadians or Americans to have political will to invest in saving the people in Indonesia. You still don't prove the actual political will that you need as a democracy. What we do have is being able to invest in research and things like that because that doesn't require democratic support. But being able to invest in long-term preventative measures that require more of a single actor and more of a scientific approach, that means that you don't need anyone to buy into your tangible or intangible mechanism. But finally then, on just abject colonialism of what this actually means. Look at this from a principled level. We think it is abhorrent that the West is able to say, we will continue our resource extraction, we will stop trying to reduce our emissions, please, as the developing world, just try and survive how you will, here are some flat figures, right? I think they have far more of a burden to tell you why we should put the onus on developing nations to adapt to us, even if they have our help, while we literally choose to stop investing in the reduction of how we are harming this earth. At the end of the day, please do not open bios and government preparedness where they tell you that they will save lives. They have 10 or 20 years at best to get to that, and we literally don't even know what's going to happen. We are far more likely to save lives long term on our side. So proud of it.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for her remarks, and now call upon the Member of Government. Here.
What we heard from an opening opposition was a team that said research about what food can grow underwater like golden rice was too hard, but somehow ozone regeneration and carbon capture and storage was perfectly easy. Like, this is ludicrous. The amount of research that they have to do on their side is quite frankly much farther than the status quo. Right now, what we have is very simple. India has erected flood barriers to prevent the vast majority of their farms from being underswept by monsoons. India has also adopted golden rice, which makes crops grow, 60% of the world now uses golden rice, which makes crops grow underwater, so when all the farms flood, you can still grow rice and you can still grow staple foods. On their side, I do not know when carbon capture comes around, because it certainly hasn't yet. We've spent 30 years looking at this thing, and literally nothing has changed. I do not know what ozone regeneration looks like. Also, I think the kinds of policies that they tend to invest in, things like sulfur aerosols, are also probably far worse for the environment, because they introduce other forms of exogenous new greenhouse gases. Opening opposition's conception was quite frankly ridiculous to say that somehow all of the research we want to do on our side was far too unrealistic, but all of their sci-fi world about what can actually take out carbon in the sky was somehow realistic. What I want to do is give 2 points of rebuttal on OO, then I want to talk about the extension. The first thing I want to say on OO is largely the point about desertification. The best case scenario for them is that they get some tangible claim to solving climate change. Number one, this does literally nothing for the vast majority of people that are affected right now. I.e., solving climate change right now does not bring the resources back in Syria, it does not help the water be fixed in all these other places. These are things that you need answers to right now. Number two, in the vast amount of time that it takes for the OO's impacts to actually materialize, a lot more people are going to be harmed. I'll tell you why that's the case. Second thing I want to point out, and this is kind of crucial, opening opposition bites the bullet. They literally concede opening government's argument when they say, yeah, maybe this isn't about carbon taxes and it's only about research. To be clear, this is ludicrous. Number one, because the vast majority of ways that you push for prevention of the status quo is through pushing for things like carbon taxes, is for pushing against things like the corporate power, things that you cannot do with CF, all of opening government's mechanisms. Number two, this hinges the entirety of the OO case on research. I think I can completely tell you why this isn't true. Conflict. Conflict is a lot more likely to occur on their side of the house. I'm going to mechanize what OO was saying was lacking to OG, which is why the West suddenly intervenes. Conflict occurs for two reasons. One, right now the way Indigenous communities are perceived to operate as is against the state and as economic burdens for the state. To be clear, this is opening opposition's mechanism, i.e., you way that developing countries see their indigenous communities is as people that do not like the state and they oppose the economic growth of the state. That happens on either side of the house. But to be clear, our side is much better for this. Why? Because when you push for things like adaptation instead of mitigation, you are not causing an economic threat to the programs that Brazil wants to do. You are not causing an economic threat to the programs that the Indian government wants to do. To be clear, developing world governments really do fucking want to industrialize. And I think it's ludicrous of OO to assume that they don't. India has embarked on one of the most massive industrialization campaigns. China industrialized so much over the last 30 years, despite the opposition of anyone who else wanted to say it. The important part here is that whenever indigenous communities oppose this and say, you can't do that, you have to stop chopping down the Amazon, or you have to stop building factories in your area, that is exactly what causes governments to see these people as problematic. What we do is simple. We give them a massively higher mobilization base because they are now allowed to ask for things that are compatible with the state infrastructure. Second point, environmental migration and the lack of resources. You cannot bring back the resources of Syria, but I want to talk about how the Syrian civil war happened. There was a drought, a massive amount of farmers lost their food, and 5 million farmers came into cities like Aleppo and Damascus, demanding that the government give them food, demanding that the government resettle their people, and the government did literally nothing, which is why conflict broke out. To be clear, this happens a lot more on their side. Why do we change this? One, I think we're quite literally fine with the West stepping in and giving these people food. Like, this is exactly what development aid looks like, specifically when it's targeted to environmental adaptation, i.e. the West saying, we will give you $1 billion. Right now, the Paris Agreement is two things. One is the part that is prevention, i.e. the climate targets. Two is the part that is adaptation. The US set up a green climate fund that is designed to give like billions and billions of dollars every single year to the developing world for problems exactly like this. We are fine saying do vastly more of those things, help resettlement occur in the vast majority of cases, and give people the farms and food that they need. What is the comparative that they have to defend? It is one in which far more conflict breaks out, i.e. once Ethiopia and Eritrea no longer have the resources that they actually want, they are actually likely to invade each other and compete in ways that they did not before. The Middle East runs into resource conflicts because suddenly all the refugees coming into Turkey are demanding food and demanding water, and literally no one has the money to do anything about it. This creates two impacts. One, the tangible threat of a refugee crisis, and two, the vast majority of the world's resources becoming under threat. I want to now be open to government. Because what opening opposition says is they say that opening government lacks the mechanism for why the West is ever likely to do the kinds of adaptation and do the kinds of things that are important in the first place. I'm going to tell you why. This creates a tangible threat to the ability of Western countries to develop and sustain their economies in the way they want to. One, the threat of a refugee crisis is quite literally a threat to most of Europe right now. I.e., if you now want to prevent the refugee crisis, what you do is you fund a bunch of farms in Syria, you fund a bunch of farms in Yemen, you fund them all across the world to make sure massively more people are traversing across the Mediterranean to get to you. Two, resources. When the United States, like the US loves oil, I think we all know that. When the United States thinks that the vast majority of its oil resources are at risk, the conflict skyrockets in those places, and they still are reliant on fossil fuels, because I guess that's the paradigm we're operating here. That means, really importantly, that the United States wants to intervene proactively, i.e. you fund all of these things because it's far cheaper for you to make sure that people in those countries have resources and the ability not to go to conflict rather than do anything they say. I think this is the same with China's extractive policies in North Africa. Yeah.
Both sides are equally speculative in terms of how research progresses. But on your side, you exacerbate the crisis and also try and solve problems that you literally cannot predict.
One, we have flood barriers. I don't think it's speculative. Two, we have golden rice. I also don't think it's speculative. They do not have carbon capture and storage. I also don't care. Like, yes, these things are speculative. You know what's not speculative? Literally giving money to people to build their new farms. That is exactly what development aid in these kinds of places does. We are very happy to support that. Opening to opposition gives you literally no material to think that the scale of colonialism, the scale of extractivity changes. What we say is we are perfectly happy to use that as an incentive. The West, these countries are terrible people, but that is exactly the point. If you turn their own perverse incentives around on them, say the only reason you can maintain your networks of infrastructure, the only reason you can maintain your networks of resources is if you do our policy, they do the policy that we like and opening government likes as well. Last thing I want to say very quickly, I think the political rhetoric massively changed in this world. Why? Because now you make more people internalize the immediate cost of climate change insofar that they have to do things like pay for adaptation, or do things like adaptation themselves, i.e. you do a lot of things, like when the US changes what it wants to do in terms of adaptation, they force a bunch of policies on people, specifically in the West. I think this is actually tangibly good because it makes more individuals say, we're internalizing the cost of climate change, therefore we don't want these things to happen, therefore we're willing to finance more for the prevention aid or the adaptation. What do we give you at the end of this debate? One, a mechanism for opening government's benefit. Two,
I'd like to thank
guess side government has been to the year 3000, they've seen the world, and not much has changed except people live underwater and grow algae farms, I guess. Absolutely insane. They've not given us a single clear long-term mechanism for how they actually help people in the long run. What I want to do for you today is talk to you a little bit about why it is the case, building off OO, that not only will developing countries get hooked on aid from developed countries, but the more realistic scenario in which developed countries don't give aid to them in the first place because they now have no incentive to do so, and those countries are the first to go. First, some rebuttal. From OG, we hear a little bit about why it is the case that this is an immediate call to action. CG talks about this in the last 30 seconds of their speech about immediate consequences. Look, they can see that the developed world still has decades before we feel the impacts of climate change. Which is to say, there's no urgency for them, and there's definitely no urgency for them to help the developing world. All they're going to do is look off from afar and say, gee, that sucks. The second thing they tell us is like, look, it's really unlikely because corporations have captured the government. So first, this motion is about allocation of resources. I think empirically we have shown that policies like trying to reduce CO2 emissions has worked. We are perfectly happy to regulate the shit out of corporations, especially if this happens at a global scale. And I think this is the most likely way that we get these impacts. CG then says, well, first of all, this technology is hard and it's bad for the environment. Look, it's equally hard for them, right? They cherry pick the example of magic rice and flood barriers, but how much time does that buy you? 10 years? 20 years? This is not a long-term solution. I think that their policies also harm the environment because, look, now you have to do things like put extra fertilizer on your farms because all the nutrients have been sucked out of the soil. That seems pretty bad for the environment. This is symmetric. Finally, this crazy stuff about conflict. Look, on both sides of the house, indigenous people still don't want to leave their homelands because it is a massively spiritual connection for them. And on either side of the house, governments still have incentives to bulldoze over them. They tell you, well, the indigenous people can now use the bargaining chip of an adaptation in order to save themselves. Look, these governments don't care about indigenous people on either side of the house. They are the most disenfranchised politically. They are the most oppressed. They are not who this money and these resources will be going to. Finally, I'm going to deal with this crazy stuff about why the United States will magically fund all these countries in extension and tell you why that's ludicrous. So what do I want to tell you a little bit about today? I want to talk to you about why it is the case that you are unlikely to get help from the very worst off in society, which seems to be what everybody in this round cares about. So first of all, I guess what message does this massive policy shift send to people within developed countries who probably have the most resources and are best equipped to take on this problem? I think it sends them the message that this is an us versus them problem, right? Which is to say, resources spent on trying to adapt to climate change are zero sum. If you give money to India or to Indonesia or to other developing countries that need this technology, that is a direct trade-off between money you could be spending to help your own citizens adapt, right? I think the counterfactual on our side of the house, no thank you, is that as the United States or as Western Europe, you have to cooperate politically with developing countries because you recognize that even if you individually cut back on CO2 emissions, it doesn't matter if there are still a bunch of developing countries out there who are polluting and who are going to lead to you suffering the impacts of that. What that means is that on our side of the house, there's a lot of international political cooperation, right? You get things like Aditya talks about, like the United States Climate Change Fund that sends money around the world because they recognize that things that happen in the developing world will negatively impact the United States. You align the interests of the most powerful countries with those that are worst off, and that is the only way that you get this kind of change. No, thank you. That means you get more money to implement technology, green technology around the world. It means that you get countries coming together to try to stop the Amazon rainfire because they know that those CO2 emissions are going to hurt them. When you get rid of, no thank you, this kind of policy, and you just say, fuck it, we're just going to adapt to this, we don't care about CO2 emissions, I think you lose out on that important aligning of incentives. What happens on their side of the house? I think now this US first policy leads to panic, right? I think people are more likely to vote for xenophobic leaders who do things like oppose immigration and climate change refugees because it just means more people that we need to save and less money that we can spend on our own citizens trying to adapt to climate change. And thank you. I think you're probably less likely to want to give out aid or to cooperate internationally because you know that that is money that you could be spending on yourself to help your own citizens. That is a direct money trade-off that doesn't exist when you're actually trying to cooperate to stop the problem at its source. The problem, no thank you, is that developing countries can't solve this problem on their own, and now they don't have access to as much aid or enough aid from these developed countries. Why? First of all, they have less money, right? They're systematically plundered by richer countries and they don't have the resources to solve this very resource-intensive problem on their own. B, there's a lot of corruption, unfortunately, which means that the resources aren't always allocated in the best way. C, political elites in these developing countries care very little about people like the indigenous society, so they are not very inspired to help them. And D, for them, the problem is the most imminent. They need to do something now, they don't have the resources opening.
So this problem assumes that this argument is in status quo. Why would Western countries invest in themselves, in their versions of themselves 50 years, as opposed to things now like political incentives, like economic incentives that we described that you never engaged in?
Look, they will invest in things that help themselves and help their citizens, right? I think that's quite clear. Nobody on side government has proven to me why the United States will give a damn about the developing countries who are currently being flooded and who currently need this kind of resources, insofar as they can just say like, well, dang, that sucks, but it's not our citizens. I think this is especially true as we get more and more xenophobic leaders like Donald Trump, who's very willing to ignore countries that don't serve his own best interest. And as I've proven to you so far, you're more likely to get people to turn out and vote for those kind of leaders, because even if leaders do actually do like the good thing and send money to other countries, that is perceived by the voting populace as you giving money away that could be used to help Americans to build our own islands in the ocean or erect flood barriers around our borders or whatever it is that they talk about, right? I think you never get that kind of stuff. But secondly, even on a domestic level, like which areas in the United States or like, Western Europe are we likely to protect first? Probably those that are best off, right? We're probably going to protect inland cities and like these areas where the richest in society, but they have the most political power because you're beholden to them in order to be reelected, right? So even if you eventually get around to helping poor people, it's too late because they were the ones who needed the help first. Here is the clear way, right? Our policy helps the worst off at the margins, right? Because every year you put off climate change, even if it's inevitable. Every inch you reduce the amount of that ocean levels are rising, the very first people you help are the worst off. And I think in the best case, you just solve climate change, which is probably pretty good, everybody lives. Their policy helps the rich first, right? Because they're the ones who get these resources first. And their best case is that rich people barricade their homes or take off to Mars or whatever, but that's our worst case, right? Because recognize rich people already have the resources they need probably to protect themselves in the long run and adapt to climate change, i.e. like building houses on hills or whatever, or taking out indigenous communities. So I think that even in their best case scenario, that is likely what happens in our worst case. We are the only team that proves why this policy is necessary to align the incentives of rich, developed countries who can actually solve the problem with the incentives of people on the ground, the vulnerable people feeling the impacts of climate change that side governments spend all their speeches talking about. We think we have a principal obligation to help these vulnerable people. No aditya, the US won't fund Syrian farms. They will just refuse to let them in, as they do at the status quo. Incredibly proud.
Remarks and now call upon the government witness.
Speaker, droughts in Eritrea cause starvation, violence, and eventually war. Migration to Jordan increases the chance that insolvent states collapse. Adaptation is a policy that starts with the developing world and ends with it. To suggest, as CEO does, that this is America first is ludicrous. I realize they also gave no responses. I'll deal with Danielle's flippancy later. To suggest, as OO does, that you can wait 30 years to solve and let 60 million refugees just appear in the ether is as ludicrous, and to ignore the mechanism for why the West gives aid in the first place, as OG does, is terminal to theirs. One, on CO, and why they had one good rip, which was as terminal for their case than anything else. Second of all, on OG and their lack of a mechanism. Third of all, on OO, high on virtue signaling, very low on solutions. One, CO. The fact that it is 40 years away beats our case, as the West says that sucks. Guys, that's the status quo that you're defending. Firstly, true, costs are not internalized currently by the developing world, But second of all, if you listen to our extension, under our side, you are directly funding adaptation projects. You can point to the material changes on the ground and show where that funding is going. Under their side, you say, yeah, we're doing research for, I don't know, some level of, I don't know, climate preventative mechanisms which look like replacing the ozone. Realize how fanciful that sounds anyway. But third of all, this increases the salience of these policies in the minds of the developed world. I'll deal more with that in a second. They then say this is an us versus them mentality, a zero-sum game. One, this creates a trade-off that the money you spend on other countries is bad for your own adaptation, supposedly. A few points to this. One, at this point, some engagement would have been really useful, because it just stands up and tells you that resource wars do massively affect the West. That turns their claim that the West has perverted incentives against them. Because it's true. They have perverse incentives to make sure that they have access to resources in countries which are most likely to descend into turmoil at the point at which you don't prepare them for this adaptation. Which is exactly why you'd engage in our policies above anything else if you did care about those resources. But second of all, mass immigration. If you're as anti-immigration as they claim, it literally bemuses me to think why you then literally let the entire developing world crumble and bear the burden of having 60, 70 million people tapping at your doorstep, but you literally cannot solve for that under our side. So yes, you do resettle. Yes, you do create more farmland in other areas. Yes, you literally create the sort of crops that the teacher tells you already exist in India, to the flippant response of Danielle saying, the magic crop. Maybe do some research and figure out that that crop already exists, Danielle. Third of all, even if this is true and this is US first, we claim a benefit that they can't. That is, rich people in the US are literally made to change their lives in a meaningful way. Because if it's true that this happens in adaptation in coastal cities in the US, this quite literally means changing the way they live internally. Maybe erecting barriers there. Maybe quite literally having firm impediments to climate change occurring. So now people literally see this is what climate change could look like, and these are the barriers that are physically being erected to stop it. Which means you're more likely to engage with the developing world's counterfactual. Literally, OG does none of this. I don't know why they're table tapping here. You're more than likely to deal with the counterfactual of the developing world sequentially after that. Three claims are made. One, on colonialism, this asymmetrically affects the Indigenous and requires them to resettle. What, guys? Do you prefer them to quite literally drown? I don't know how woke that is, but quite literally, if the scale of time exists as it does, 1, 2, 3 more years of stasis, as they claim, are quite literally terminal to the very Indigenous people they claim to protect under their side. So, it is more likely that you probably do have to resettle them. You probably do have to make sure they have some form of counterfactual when you invest in the infrastructure, for example, in places like the Middle East, in North Africa. These very same areas they wanted to target are the ones we need the most help in. But second of all, somehow they take exception to the idea of building up cities. You mean what China is doing in the Spratly Islands now? Guys, this already exists. You already do build countries, and it's actually not that difficult. But second of all, they somehow believe that the trillions of dollars poured into gratuitous climate change research is less than what would be spent on infrastructure. Balance how much money is being spent on climate change resource under the status quo with no tangible manifestation, which is why you're having the cutbacks now, versus what happens under our side when you quite literally build something. Third of all, mate, you're caveating in carbon extraction. That is, first of all, economically untenable. Second of all, given no time scale by their team, which is exactly why you're likely to incur the most harm to the most vulnerable Indigenous people under their side. Their second point is that you cannot restructure their economies. A few points here. One, that's exactly why they can't prevent or mitigate. Their economy is predicated on economically noxious structures. But Aditya's analysis is really clear here. That's exactly why the West, pontificating and telling them, the AU, all you need to do is emit less carbon, is really bad. But instead, when you offer to the AU to collaborate to build things in their own house, in their own regions, in their own countries, without saying, you just need to get rid of the very industries that sustain your economy under the status quo, that probably changes the colonialist rhetoric when you're not literally pontificating and saying, that's really easy, you just haven't done what we do yet, and actually haven't done. I'll take opening.
Yeah, you may call carbon recapture fanciful, but surviving the next 200 years instead of the next 20 is equally as far-fetched. It is far more likely that our solution materialize when you don't rely on international compliance and you don't exacerbate the crisis, making it progress even faster.
The point is, guys, they've lost all of the support for the very research they're talking about in their best-case scenario because it hasn't tangibly manifested anyway. So they don't actually have the political capital to invest as much. Realize that this has political impacts as well. When Donald Trump, under their side, stands up and says, the research hasn't done anything because climate change isn't real, that's a very different narrative to, we need to adapt to some of the effects that we see playing out now, and as well as more likely to be politically palatable to many more people on a broad spectrum. On OG, they give a decent overarching framework of why you ought to favour the most developing countries, and their mechanism is short-termism of politicians, corporate backlash. The gaping hole in their case is they don't explain why the West cares about this adaptive norm about the developing world. They assert that it becomes about the immediate effect, and that's why you care about the developing world. In the same case, they also say, these effects are already happening, but the West isn't doing anything. This is why the West intervenes, and this is why extension wins. 1. Aditya tells you about Indigenous mobilization, receives no response. That is 1. Currently, Indigenous mobilization looks like the prevention of industrialization campaign. 2. This induces Bolsonaro to claim that a fire accidentally tore through the Amazon. What happens under our side? You're better at co-opting international and national support, i.e. when transnational movements push for increasing infrastructure, which also bolsters economic prosperity within those countries, you're more likely to gain the sort of ground swell support that they don't gain. But second of all, the West wades into resources waters under our side. 1. The threat of refugees is exactly what you want to prevent, immigration crises. 2. Conflicts place oil resources under risk. It's far cheaper to intervene now, and second of all, far more politically palatable under our side when it is quite literally intervening in a tangible way versus trying to solve environmental change in the long term. We're the only ones who give you the clearest mechanism, clearest stakeholders in this debate. Let's start back.
I'd like to thank the government whip for those remarks, and now call upon the opposition whip to close out the debate.
What we showed in this debate from opposing opposition is very simple. The states that have the resources to act on climate change, like all states, are selfish. Our choice in this debate is between those selfish states spending their money on adaptation or spending it on prevention. And we cannot ignore the fact that either way, they will be spent either entirely or mostly in selfish ways. The consequence of this is that we should spend the money in ways that naturally spills over to helping the most vulnerable countries in the world, not ways that when they are spent domestically, they only help the country where they are spent. As an example, if the United States cuts its emissions by 90%, it will help the entire world. But if the United States builds a wall around New York City to stop the floodwaters from coming in, it will only help New York City. This is an extremely simple and obvious mechanism that no one on government bench has been able to answer or respond to. So, as a consequence of this, the best choice, given limited resources and given limited political will on both sides of the House, is that all countries should spend money in a way that even when this is selfish, even when they are beholden to the interests of their voters, who will vote them out of office if they allocate tons of their budgets to helping other countries in the developing world, we should spend it in ways that naturally spills over to help countries that cannot help themselves. We proved two things in extension. Because prevention is good for everyone and adaptation is zero-sum, there are two natural consequences of this. First, for climate change itself, we actually save more people on our side of the House, in particular people who cannot help themselves. Because on their side of the House, the vast majority of resources for adaptation will help people who can already adapt on their own, right? Who can afford to pick up and move inland to middle America where the floodwaters are not going to reach, right? But there are a bunch of people who cannot do that because, as opening opposition pointed out, they live in islands. Literally the only way to help them is to not have global temperatures rise, and every ½ degree Celsius that we prevent it from rising saves literally thousands, if not millions of lives. But the second thing we proved is about the political consequences of the adaptation approach, which I think we quite neatly proved will amount to eco-fascism. That is to say, the things that help my country are often located in another country. The things that will help my civilians often will trade off with things that help other people. Closing government is like, oh my god, no, countries will be altruistic because they don't want to create climate refugees. What I think we already proved is that countries will close the doors on those climate refugees. We did not get a response to this because of the kind of governments that will be elected on their side of the house. Let's weigh this. First, every degree of climate change we prevent, as I pointed out, saves a ton of lives. But it's not clear that this is true for the mechanism from them because the political incentives that we gave you showed that their money would be spent broadly in ways that doesn't help the lives of people on the margins. So it's not clear that they can save people in the next 10 to 20 years. Second though, their side of the house causes a permanent shift in politics towards fascism and towards repression and not helping people who live in the developing world. This is the biggest and most long-term impact in this debate, and it affects all future responses to climate change, right? So even if you think, maybe we can build some walls or plant some rice in the next 5 to 10 years, the water will get higher and go over the wall. Come on, seriously, this is way, way, way more important because future responses to climate change, no thank you, will be needed, and their side of the house creates a politics that makes those responses impossible for the vast majority of humanity. The best case for them is that the richest survive and get to live on hills or go to Mars and everyone else dies. I do not think that is a best case that they should be defending. The final consequence of this, I think, is a lack of cooperation. In fact, what we prove happens on their side of the house is war and conflict as countries go to take over other countries that have the resources to protect their citizens. Their response that you don't want to create climate refugees ignores the political analysis that we gave you. These are not asymmetric wars, right? If the United States military wanted to take over 4 countries in the developing world tomorrow, they could literally do that. There is no response to the idea that we will have incentives to do that when we aren't relying on cooperation between the countries and instead have a zero-sum game that is created only on their side of the house. We further told you that cooperation is a necessary prerequisite for actually stopping or doing anything about climate change, especially in the most vulnerable areas of the world. On our side of the house, that cooperation actually does stuff. Green technology can spread from where it is created in the West to the developing world because the prevention approach only works if everyone is on board, right? If India is still emitting tons and tons of CO2, prevention in the US doesn't do that much. So we have to help them. Their side fundamentally creates conflict between countries, whereas our side incentivizes cooperation. We've won right there. I'll take those.
Developing countries do not have money in order to invest in this technology. We gave Mex on intangibility/tangibility, oil lobbying groups, and the narrative of creating jobs, while CG gives a subsidiary impact.
Sure. We're not defending the status quo. We're talking about how countries should allocate a set of resources that exists on either side of the house. Furthermore, I just explained how the West will give this technology to the developing world for free because they don't want to fucking go underwater. Okay, the only way you could maybe think about voting for either gov team on weighing is speed. They're we have this stuff now. We've got rice, and we've got walls, and we can build it now. This is predicated on the idea that they have money to do those things. We already proved they will not get those resources from the West because they are selfish. Second, this only accounts for maybe the next 5 years, and even then I'm not sure it'll save anyone. A human needs more than some rice and not being underwater to live. No one has explained how it saves any lives. You've still got deserts, you've still got higher temperatures, but you can't grow any crops. The water the rice is in is going to be hot. Their side is the literal destruction of ecosystems. They haven't explained how they save anyone. Look. Opening government can't win because most of their case is about how developing countries should spend money that they do not have to adapt to climate change. We proved they don't get that money, so maybe one wall will delay things for 2 years. That's not enough. We rebutted CG by saying that all of the conflict and all of this stuff happens more on their side of the house when they pit countries against one another. Most of their impacts are not unique to the prevention or adaptation approach. They're just people will suffer when climate change happens. Most of the impacts they talked about will happen on their side as well. Only on our side do we get the cooperation necessary between countries to save lives. We are so proud to oppose.